Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back Vishaan Chakrabarti.
Good morning again. I'm going to do something rather perilous, which is like the two friends and colleagues, great architects who came just before me. I have stood on this stage with my former partners at Shop. Any number of architects have stood on this stage to show audiences like yours beautiful image after beautiful image of what a Penn Station could look like. We all know that if the garden moved, if we had the right kind of impetus in our society, that there are any number of great architects around the world who could deliver a great Penn Station. I don't think that's really the point. And in fact, in some ways, it's been hurting us because this is really not about architecture. At the core level, Penn Station is overcrowded, it's unsafe, and as Michael Kimmelman wrote, if you're going to build new garden hoses, you can't pour the water into the same decrepit little rusty bucket. And so I think that the real catalyst, what we have to look to, now let's see if that works. I just formed a firm yesterday, so I don't even have the capacity to make pretty pictures yet. But what I wanted to do is just give you a couple of cartoons. And the cartoons are really about, like, what is the potential catalyst to really make something happen? And I truly believe it is Gateway. It is the fact that we have a new tunnel alignment coming into what's known as Block 780. What many of you may know about that, what you don't know probably, is that tunnel and its rails are set at a profile that are coming underneath Hudson Yards, underneath the project that Jill just showed you, that Roger just showed you, and it's pretty close to grade, which means that those blocks just south of Madison Square Garden are going to have to be demolished in order to build new tracks and platforms to add to Penn Station. It's an extraordinary act. And obviously, there are people living there are businesses there. It's going to be a big controversial moment in order to understand what it means to build this tunnel and bring in new tracks and platforms into New York City. And it really is going to affect a landmass that stretches across even beyond 7th and 8th Avenue. And what that means in our minds, and when I was at Shop, we talked about this with some of my colleagues, is there the potential not just for a new station, but new open space? This is an area that is dramatically lacking in open space as not just an amenity, but a real urban attractor that will create value in this entire neighborhood. Is there the potential for new development sites in the red? And gee, if you had a new open space south of a new Penn Station, you might actually get sunlight into that station. And so that's a kind of interesting idea that you could start to think about, well, if the garden, as Jill just spelled out and many of us have talked about, moved to the Morgan Postal Facility with its development rights, that you could create a new Penn Station on the square that sits just across from the Farley Building. You could have a park just south of it. You could have new development. And then I think the thing that is the much more ecological thing that we need to think about, which is the ecology of the economy of what is happening to the south. What is really important to remember is the Nomad Hotel and a lot of sort of interesting activity is sitting just to the southeast here. These are two manufacturing zones. They have an enormous potential to be part of our new economy in New York City with a new Penn Station and a new park that would actually bring you into this new network of spaces and development. And so the point I was really trying to make with this is not to say, gee, the new station should be stone or glass, it should be this kind of architecture or that kind of architecture. I really think that we have to be at a more basic level of conversation here, which is the garden should move. It deserves a brand new facility. The station is unsafe. Don't spend more than a couple of minutes in that station if you don't have to. It's very serious business. And so it's based on that and based on the fact that Gateway, I believe, is going to happen. I believe we have to, because of the post-Sandy damage and the current tunnels, build new tunnels. That means these blocks are going to get redeveloped. And that should be, we should not be standing here 10 years from now with another parade of architects showing you beautiful images of a new Penn Station. At some point, it just becomes relentless and meaningless. We have to think about what are the political catalysts, what are the funders that are going to get us there. And I just want to close with, well, first of all, just to say, we need to think about what is a major, major problem and break it down into its components. right? So there are the gateway components. There is how to move the garden and get them a great new facility, incentivize them to want to move. Think about the neighborhoods to the south. Think about Vornado's properties, but really think about the components as a whole. And then we will get to, and this is a collaboration I did with Norman Foster back in 2008, we will get to what a beautiful station is. I have no doubt as to this city's capacity to build something great, but let's move through the steps that get us there. And I think to help me in that next step of the conversation, I'm going to be joined by Jamie Torres-Springer and Kate Ascher, two great friends, two great urbanists, and we're going to talk through the pragmatics of all that. Thank you.
Hello.
Guys.
Vishaan,
Hi.
congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Kate, I want to start with you because you know the railroads inside and out. And it seems to me that, at least in the early phases of the attempts to redevelop Penn Station in the 90s, that the railroads were never really brought into the conversation in the way that they needed to be brought into the conversation. That was at least my take on it back then. What's your take on what the railroads need and how they approach this problem?
Well, I guess the use of the word railroads is kind of
Right.
complicated, because if there was one railroad, it would be a lot easier, but there's not. There's three very separate interests. There's more than that, but if we talk about entities, there's three, and what's in Amtrak's interest is not necessarily what the Long Island Railroad is worried about or what New Jersey Transit is worried about. So, I think for a start, you have three entities. That's complicated. Before you think about city, state, property owners, anything else, there are not that many places where you have three different rail entities, certainly in this city. So I think it really does, to me, it starts from the ground up.
Do you feel those three railroads want different things out of a potentially redeveloped station?
I'm not sure if I were a railroad, I would be as worried about the total definition of the station. I'm worried about getting my trains in, getting my trains through, the passenger experience for my customers. I'm worried about reliability, I'm worried about safety, and I'm worried about customer service. Really, I think that's what I'm worried about.
I had an Amtrak executive say to me many years ago that the Acellas were full, basically, and that the condition of Penn Station didn't impact their ridership very much. So why should that be the focus of their energy? Now, I think that was a long time ago, and I think Amtrak, to be fair, has completely shifted their position on that and is interested in Farley and so forth. But it was an astounding moment for me, because as a person who thinks about the station, that wasn't their key concern. So does that mean then that, in terms of, because you're really talking about things like capacity, so Gateway, how close are we to getting Gateway done?
How close in terms of time or money, who knows? But I think Gateway intellectually is there. I think it's an idea that will happen, but then again, I thought ARC would happen, so who knows, right? But something's going to happen. We will have another tunnel at some point. Hopefully it will be this one.
So Jamie, help me, I was trying to, again, with these sort of cartoons almost, talk about what is the potential neighborhood impact of all of this redevelopment. Because Penn Station today, I think everyone would agree, is not exactly the most thriving neighborhood in Manhattan relative to the rest of our city. So could you talk about that from a sort of pure, from the point of view of what you do?
Yeah, and the cartoons were helpful. I think just to take one step back, the kind of framework that I would put around thinking about paying for something like this is identify what the benefits are, figure out who they accrue to, and particularly if they generate some cash flow to certain entities, and then figure out how to capture those benefits to pay for it. So I think I just want to put it in that context, because to say something sort of slightly provocative, I think the sort of, from my sense, is that the idea that there is, as you just said, a general transit network expansion benefit associated with a new Penn is, it's sort of marginal, right? When you look at improvements like Gateway, even, if you look in the MTA's capital plan, the advanced signal improvements on certain lines, and then even some of the proposals that the city put out in its long-term plan in April, extension to, the Utica Avenue extension, a whole series of ideas that expand the capacity of the network. those benefits accrue to the interdependence of the whole system and the region and the ability to continue to move workers around the region. And so I think these are helpful, but marginally helpful in that respect. The real benefit, as you say, is I think a couple things. One is, what's the city's brand, and how competitive is the city in having a gateway, especially when gateway is completed, that's attractive to people who will continue to commute into the city, and we can talk more about that. And then, neighborhood level, district level redevelopment benefits. So this is the district that you were referring to. It's heavily underutilized. There is 14 million square feet of office in the Penn Station district. It represents about 5% of all of the Midtown, the largest central business district in the country, but it underperforms. Its average rent is $55 a foot compared to $77, $78 a foot across all of Midtown, and so that's a very significant. I mean, even if you just brought that existing 14 million square feet up to that average, you're talking about another $150, $200 million a year in rent, and then you've got your redevelopment potential, which.
So let's focus on that, because I think this is a critical issue. And obviously, we talked about value capture in the earlier panel with folks from other parts of the world. So the number 7 line just opened. It opened because of essentially a tax increment financing system that is, borrowed money, captured, and is paying off the debt on that money by captured value from, future tax revenues, incremental growth, and that all seems to be working. Now, and I forget the exact number, but it was something like a sort of $5 billion bond issuance, and it seems to be working. Seem to be paying back the bonds. Given what you just talked about, the fact that there's 14 million square feet, it's underperforming. Kate, you used to work at Vornado. You know this very well in terms of Vornado's properties, but even beyond Vornado, there's a lot of property there that could be much more valuable. If you can do a $5 billion, I'm using round numbers, if you can do a $5 billion value capture to extend a subway, build some parks, and build an extraordinary amount of development on the west side, could you do a $10 billion value capture to capture to basically, bond against the future value of what that neighborhood could be with a great Penn Station, a great park, and again, not just thinking about the west side, but thinking about Bryant Park, Columbus Circle, Times Square, all of these other places, these neighborhoods that we've repositioned in New York City.
Yeah, I think you could. I mean, my former partner and good friend Jim Lima's here, and his study was a very good study a couple years back that showed that I think something like in excess of $1 billion, almost $1.5 billion worth of development rights are potentially sitting there. And actually, the numbers that Jim was using a couple years ago, I think we're likely to see almost double those numbers in Midtown East as a result of this extraordinary increase in the value of development. And the thing that no one foresaw a few years ago, which is that Class A office, Class B office too, even outside of Manhattan, would become feasible for development now. So I don't think it's $10 billion.
Give me a number.
I suspect. I think Jim's number is a very carefully crafted number, and it's very conservative because of the value of development rights. But anything like this has to there has to be a capital sources stack, right? And so I think if you look at other projects like this, Union Station, which we heard about, 30th Street Station in Philly, which we're working on as a district level redevelopment. Denver's rebuilding Union Station. Even our friends in Canada are redeveloping Union Station in Toronto. At least 50% is publicly funded by federal, state, and city money, usually a little north of 50%. And then you can cobble together a district financing scheme. I mean, the other two problems with making that work here are there's some overlap with that Hudson Yards district that you talked about. There's about 4 or 5 blocks that are in the Hudson Yards district, so that detracts from that a little bit. It's also, there's probably 40 million square feet of office development between Hudson Yards and wherever we end up with Midtown East, so it's going to take a while to work that out. But we've got sort of infinite demand, it seems, for high quality housing, which tends to be worth more. So there's a good development rights play there. And then again, we have the difference with Hudson Yards is there's a lot of existing development, and it will increase significantly in value. Now, there's one particular entity that owns most of that, and they are already contributing significantly to Moynihan and to improving the streetscape around it. But that's something else to look at, is just what's the incremental value. As I said, $150 million in annual rent increases just to get up to the average of Midtown, that's probably $7, $8, $9, $10 million a year in taxes to the city. If it all gets valued in. So there's a number of different ways that you can look at stacking up the financing of this.
So Kate, do you want to build on that?
In what respect?
Well, I mean, again, you know that neighborhood extremely well. You know the development values in that neighborhood extremely well. And I guess one of the questions I find myself thinking about, because I think you've thought about it from both perspectives, and we talked about this earlier in the panel. Like, so for instance, there might be tension between the transportation planning imperative, which is to say we want clear sight lines, we don't want all this retail and signage and all of this other stuff, and the need, we don't have all the money in the world, so we need some of that retail and signage to fund anything to happen there. And just how does one strike the right balance between these things? Because, you can prime the pump by adding, in the capital stack Jamie was talking about, if you get more private money, well, the private money expects a return. Right, and so how do you balance this?
Well, I mean, I guess one of the things that Jamie said, which is right. I mean, this is Amtrak's property. The federal government has a very strong interest in this place, which means that whether it's through Gateway or some other mechanism, there will be other funding outside of what the local area can support. And I think it's getting those numbers right. In terms of how it works down into the physicality of a place, there's no formula you can really talk about. That all is literally and granularly negotiated as you look at what's the right mix of retail, what's the right space for passenger flow, what's the right treatment of whatever it is, passenger drop-off. And those decisions are big ones. Even though they seem small, that actually helps make the experience and affects the way the neighborhood works as a whole. And that can't be done by one side or the other. It has to be done with everybody at the table. And part of the problem with this issue is it's not clear to me that everybody's ever been at the table in a way that makes them feel like an active participant. And when you look at Washington, when you look at Union Station, when you look at something like Transbay in San Francisco, you see these sort of entities whose entire job is to bring everybody to the table. And that, I think, there's something to be said for having that group actually determine and sculpt the answer.
So by my count, we've had at least 3 convenings of periods where there was a massive amount of energy among the stakeholders to try to get something done. I think there are 3 or 3.5 environmental impact statements, back to Philip's talk. But in each instance, something, whether it was a sort of exogenous factor or something about the deal itself, in each instance, it didn't quite work. Now, to be fair, we are building the first phase in Farley, and I do think the first phase in Farley has a lot of transportation value, and I applaud the state for that. But I'm just, we just heard from the head of Union Station that she is the convening factor. She's the one who gets all of these stakeholders into a room and figures it out. What's our dilemma here? Why isn't this working?
Well, I think you just said it yourself. It's not clear to me who or what that convening factor would be. I mean, remember, Grand Central is a different situation. There is one property owner. Metro North owns that station. And whether you're Jackie Onassis or whoever you are that cared about it, there was a place to go to fix it. This is much harder. It's harder not just as a piece of real estate, but as an operating station. There are 3 entities that jointly operate it. You don't even know who's running the place.
For the sake of the audience, because sometimes this gets too convoluted, and it's a fairly easy explanation. Basically, when Penn Station was torn down in '63, Amtrak was given the ownership of the station below the sidewalk. So Amtrak owns everything below the sidewalk. Above the sidewalk is sort of owned jointly by Vornado and Madison Square Garden. And so that makes for and then there's air rights above that, and there's all sorts of interesting debates about who owns what in terms of the air rights. But it's very complicated relative to Grand Central. I think that's right. But doesn't that say, though, that Amtrak is the primary convener, or no?
Amtrak is the one who really holds the cards, because you can't do anything if you don't address how those passengers need to move through that station. And the physicality of the place is is ownership and is those leases with the Long Island Railroad and New Jersey Transit. And if you don't start by recognizing that, I don't really think you can get anywhere in terms of planning for this great new station.
Having said that, you know, Amtrak has a certain set of interests, which you just described, Kate, and it's not the same as those pictures that we saw. That's not what's most important to them. So the other player in here is the entity responsible for building and growing the city, which is the city. So I think it's a matter of this becoming a priority for the administration as well. I think there's, sorting out the MTA capital plan and who was paying for what was probably the biggest lift that had to get made out of City Hall on these issues. And now that that's done, presumably there's some room to maneuver. I mean, the other thing I'd say about that, which is a little bit of a transition, is we shouldn't sort of sit here and talk about this as if it was 2 years ago and nothing has changed. I mean, there's a set of priorities for how the city grows that have been very clearly articulated. And so to me, it's the summit for New York City, not the summit for Penn Station. There are opportunities to grow employment in transit concentrated centers all over the city. And thinking about Penn Station on its own is great. It's clearly there's a lot to think about, but thinking about how you grow jobs and improve neighborhoods and place make in places that are emerging employment centers in a way like Penn Station, downtown Brooklyn, Long Island City, eventually places like Broadway Junction. Looking at all of that together and figuring out how to finance improvements is probably the most effective way to get this made a priority for the city.
I buy that, and clearly, I think Jill talked about the Port Authority, and it's interesting to think about, well, should if there's maglev someday, should it come to the World Trade Center site where we have an abundance of expensive stations and actually not a lot of train capacity, versus Penn Station where we have an abundance of trains and not a lot of expensive stations. So we have this interesting dichotomy there. I agree that you have to think citywide, but I mean the city doesn't seem to have a lot of levers in this situation in terms of all the stakeholders at Penn. They don't own anything. They have some air rights control here and there, but it seems to me what we saw at the tail end of the Bloomberg administration is the way these things got worked out is there was a sort of amicable divorce. The state or the city ended up running Governor's Island or Brooklyn Bridge Park or whatever it was because it was just too hard to figure it out together. So whereas I understand the city has its imperatives here, it's really hard to understand how the city has any major levers. I could be wrong about that.
It's the zoning.
It's the zoning.
Well, I mean, you could say that for transport in the city as a whole.
Right.
I mean, remember, there are people who believe the city should run its own transport system, but it doesn't. And yet, it does influence it. So I think it's a question of, what is that soapbox with a bit of control over zoning? What is it able to do? And I think the answer is probably a lot, because somebody's got to be somewhat neutral in terms of bringing all these parties together. So I think that if the city wanted to play that role, that would be a good role for it to play.
So we have about a minute left. I would love to get from both of you what you see as the sort of central impediment as well as the central next step. You can do that in 30 seconds, right?
Well, I can start. But the impediment to me, again, I was trained as a political scientist, is what we've been talking about, that there's so many entities and their interests effectively diverge in many ways, not in two ways, in many ways. So that's the central impediment. But the second part of your question was?
What's the best next step?
Well, I actually think the fact that Gateway has momentum and is going to happen, we just need to ride that wave, because that means that we need to think in a much more longer-term fashion about the station. And because that is going to happen, I think it offers an opportunity that we won't have again and need to really make hay while the sun shines.
I'll say it quickly. Gateway and Gateway.
Gateway. Thanks, everyone. Thank you both.
Thank you.